I once did a talk, and about halfway through, you know, anybody, if you've done any public speaking, you know that you've lost the audience. There's a sort of a shield comes up between you, and they're just there. So I thought, perhaps they can't hear me. So I said, can you all hear if I speak at that level? And the chap at the back put his hand up and he said, I can't hear you. And a fellow at the front row put his hand up and he said, I've heard every word he said so far. Would you like to change places? Think about that. Don't think too far. So if you can all hear, this is an informal talk, not a lecture as such. And we're going to look at the basic idea behind the question which is most asked on the roadshow. Well, most asked after how much is it worth. Then it's how do you know how old it is? And it's very tempting to say years of experience, of course. But it's not. It's very simple. How do we tell how old something is, whether it is 1780 or 1690 or 1830 or whatever date? And it's basically putting together three elements. One is the use of something, one is the material from which it's made, and the other is the shape. Each period has a shape which embodies the social life of the time. And I hope during the next half an hour we'll have a look and I'll show you what I mean. First of all, we have to look at the use of things. Think of Shakespeare's typewriter. I've seen one labelled as such. It's an impossibility, isn't it? He couldn't have he would have used one if he could. Chippendale would have used chipboard if he'd had it available. Of that we know, because it's a stable material. But he couldn't. And if you narrow that down to something a little more serious, that's always good. If we narrow that down to something perhaps more easily memorable, if you know the little caddy spoons that Grandma always had in her tea caddy, right? Little short bowl, round bowl, and it went inside the caddy, and there was always one teaspoonful for every guest and one for the pot. Remember that? Yeah. Right. Well, good, I'm glad you do. Well, a friend of mine, well, he's an ex-friend now, but he had a little bit of a bust up. He spent an enormous amount of money. He rang me about 3 years ago now, and he rang and he said, I have just bought a Charles II caddy spoon, fully hallmarked, and it's beautiful. And I said, well, it may be beautiful, it may be fully hallmarked, but it has to be a fake, it cannot be right. And then we started to argue, and I said, okay, fine. Let me just tell you, we didn't need a caddy spoon, although we had tea in the 1680s, 1660s. We didn't need a caddy spoon because we didn't chop up our tea into little tiny pieces until the 1740s. The first person ever recorded by using anything at all to transport the tea leaves, which they came over rather like a big old fat dry cigar, and you crinkled this over the boiling water, just as originally the story goes that Chinese was sitting under a tree and a tea leaf came down and it infused with the boiling water, and that was the beginning of tea, thousands of years ago. However, Lady Walpole was the first person ever to be portrayed using the cover from a sugar bowl to transport the tea from the caddy to the pot, and that was 1724. So, you cannot have a Charles II caddy spoon. That's just social history. That's how you know how old a caddy spoon can be at its earliest. If you think you can't have an Elizabeth I hard-paste porcelain coffee pot. We didn't make hard-paste porcelain, and we didn't drink coffee until 1650, 100 years after Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. So it's just simple history. It's so easy once you get to think about it. And then we look at materials. In the furniture industry, we had a chronological development of oak In the earliest times, always Baltic oak to make good furniture for churches and houses. We had Baltic oak, then we had walnut imported from France and Italy and Spain, and then we had mahogany imported from the Jamaica and the Western East Indies, in that order. Not until the 1770s did we import exotic timbers from the East and West Indies, like satinwood and coromandel and rosewood and so forth. So that's easy to remember, and you just slot it into a little, like a frame. We didn't have Sheffield plate until the 1770s. You can't have a George I Sheffield plate coffee pot. It doesn't exist. And once you start to think along those lines, it's easy. Okay? Now, we've had the shape and the use. There was one idea came to me the other day. We were talking about dumb waiters. I just did a roadshow yesterday, and somebody brought along a 3-tier dumb waiter. And he said, this is George I. And I said, well, I hate to disagree with you, because no doubt you've got family history that goes with it. But in fact, it couldn't be before the 1750s. Well, it could be 1747. And he said, well, why? How do you know? And I said, well, it wasn't really until the mid-1740s that our society had changed. We were full in society of young, very wealthy people. There was a huge middle, upper and rich, wealthy class of people. Most of them, as I say, were young, and huge dinner parties were absolutely the thing of the day. The problem was, and it became a national problem, they used to drink too much. Nothing's changed, thank goodness. But the problem with there was that they would become indiscreet in front of the staff. Now you must remember at the same time, we had at this time service à la française, which enabled or demanded one single person to every guest. Now, very few people, even the wealthiest, had enough staff to cater for 40 people for dinner. So they'd go out into the town or the village, and they would simply put a livery on anybody they could find, standing behind someone and say, look after this chap. And of course, these chaps got so drunk, they started talking about political secrets and land deals, and the staff would bribe the guests. They would blackmail them. And so something had to be done, and it became such a national trouble that we had to change our society's habits. And within 3 years, we had changed from either stop drinking so much or dispense with the staff during meal times. The staff would serve the food, then disappear. Which did we do? Well, it was no race, really. We got rid of the staff during the meal times. That was the beginning of all the table and dining accessories we know today, such as bottle sliders to put the decanter on the table instead of having it served for you. Some have wheels on and go up and down the table. Cheese trolleys with wheels on, so you wheel those up and down the table. We had sideboards with a cupboard each end of the board, one with ice in and one with a steel lining, an iron lining, with red hot coals in, one to keep things hot, one to keep things cold, just like a hostess trolley today. Amazing. They were thinking of this in the 1740s. We do not have wine labels to tell us what we were drinking before the 1740s because we didn't need them. We don't have bottle sliders, decanter stands, cheese trolleys, dumb waiters. We invented a dumb waiter because you could wheel it up and down behind you and it had trees on it or extra cutlery. It's called a dumb waiter. It couldn't say anything. It was a dumb waiter. We do not have George I dumb waiters. Didn't exist. Does that make sense? Yes. So now you can do my job. It's easy. You'll just come up on the roadshow and say, this is George III. It has to be. Right. So that is use. We've done material. Let's look at shape now. Right. Basically, each period had a shape which epitomizes the period. So if you look at an Elizabethan man, he will have puff sleeves and puff trousers, balloony type trousers. And you look at his dining table and it will have puff legs, and a bed will have big cup and cover turning for its supports. The furniture looked like the people, in certain respects. If people say, I don't know anything about antiques, but I love gardening. If you know about gardening, you must know about antiques, because an Elizabethan garden will have a box hedge in it with geometric patterns which you walk through. And you go inside the house and they're on the ceiling, they're on the tapestry, they're on the silverware. It was a universal pattern which went through. We don't have time to go into all those tonight, so we're going to look at just one period, the 18th century. And for the first 3/4 of the 18th century, we had one basic design. It was a curvilinear design upon which we piled any amount of romantic, imaginative designs. Chinese designs, we were infatuated by the Chinese. We didn't like the Frenchmen very much, but we loved the Chinese. Nothing's changed. Exactly. We had Gothic designs. We encrusted a basic simple shape with these imaginative designs for the first 75 years of the 18th century. It changed. In the 1750s, we started to excavate in Rome and in Italy generally. Then when we couldn't get into Italy because we were having trouble with Napoleon, we went to Greece and we excavated there. And we found what the ancients furnished their houses with below ground. We knew above ground. We knew the noble orders of architecture from the time of Henry VIII, certainly. The Grand Tour was already in full swing. We didn't know what the furnishings were until we started to dig. And there in the baths of Caracalla, the Diocletian, Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli, we found rows of Regency furniture, designs for Wedgwood pots, but they hadn't been invented yet. They were there for us to find. And that changed the whole domestic scene of design in English interiors forever, until we started to revive things, and that's another story. So let's look at the first basic shapes that we see affecting interiors and our basic domestic articles. There, if you can imagine, you double that up, you invert it. That is the balustrading of any Palladian house, any great staircase from 1720 to 1760. So 1720 to 1765. So. Right? You okay with that? Yes? So you put a handle on it and you have a pot. Silver pot, clay pot, pottery, pewter, brass, whatever. If you put a lid on it, you have a proper tankard. It's big. Any other material, usually, in this case, pewter or silver. If you put a spout on it, you have a jug, another sort of spout, you have a pot. All between 1720 and 1765. That was it. Upon which you could put Rococo designs, which came through from Italy, filtered up through France, in raffle leaves and scrolls, inorganic matter, anything you like, you could encrust that, but that was the basic shape. And it affected furniture too. We do a similar sort of little back like so. You see all right? And you've got a chair, the same period. It's the basic shape of a chair from 1720, not a very good one, but there you are. All right? Now this was sometimes inverted and pierced, but that was the basic shape. By the 1750s, this started to grow wings, and you have wings coming outside here, but still the center splat, that's called the middle bit, was a Rococo design, the baluster design. And so you have little tables, wine glasses, all had a little baluster stem, like so, and you put a top on it, some legs, there. All that early period before 1760. And so the next thing that happened was we found not a baluster shape, but one of simplicity and elegance. An egg cup, a Roman shield. And the same thing applied. Put a handle on it, you have a cup. Put a lid on it, you have a tankard. Put a spout on it, have a jug. If you have another spout on it, you have a pot. Usually engraved with a little coat of arms like so, and then usually another little vase on top. After 1770. It won't be before. It hadn't hit the commercial market. It didn't happen. And the same thing happened with furniture. Put a seat on it, and you have what we call a Sheraton chair or Robert Adam chair. Put some little arms on that one. Okay? Does anybody know Woburn Abbey? Anybody been to Woburn Abbey? Yes. Okay. They have the greatest gift for education there in anywhere outside the V&A and or the Jeffrey Museum, because you go from one room into another. And in Woburn Abbey, they've got the Chippendale room to start with, and it's all this Rococo stuff. And you move from that into the next room, and it's all satinwood and this style. And nobody's telling you. Nobody's saying, oh, look, there's the great change. You can tell that's after 1770, that's before. Anyway, you better not film that bit. I shall be in serious trouble. Then we have to look at legs. How are we doing for time, chaps? All right. We have to look at legs. First legs, basic leg, in English furniture was of two types. One was a cabriole. The other, which is cabriole, is a French dancing term meaning to bound or leap. More of that in a minute. The first one was a straight leg. Very, very severe, very masculine, and it could take any type of carved decoration. The only trouble with a square leg like that is, we've got them here, if you look at one leg straight on, it's great. If you look at that leg, it looks thicker because you are looking at that angle there. So that one looks thicker than that. So what they did before the 1770s was to take off the inside corner. It's called inside chamfer. That means when you look at that leg, it looks the same thickness as that one. Brilliant. And that lasted until, for major pieces of furniture, until the 1740s, by which time this square leg had got a serpentine front to it, like that. That's a moulding, that's a section of it, a serpentine front. The big change came when the classical period came in, and instead of that, we started to taper. And so a taper leg came in, which had a spade foot. Now, you didn't have to chamfer the inside because of it tapering, it looked the same anyway, which was brilliant. After 1770, before 1770. The next great change, and this is how we say how old something could be, after the 1770s and during, they started to turn legs again. And this time it had a tulip foot on it. And that became extremely popular by the 1785, 1790. But we were unable to leave things alone. We could not resist decorating. And you can just imagine two chaps in a workshop talking to one. That's a plain leg there, Charlie. Shall we do something about it? Well, why don't we put a ring around it? Oh, okay, then. Let's put two rings there. That's nice. Shall we put two at the bottom? Okay. Why don't we put some in the middle? And that's how we tell a table or a chair, either before or after 1800, because the more rings it has, the later it gets. Easy. The simpler, the earlier. So, plain one, 1790, 1785, two lots of rings, 1795, 1810, three lots of rings, 1815, 1820. Easy. Then we started to develop by the 1830s, and we had tables which looked like, table legs which looked like that, with the cast rod, and they were rooted, like billiard table legs. And all you have to do is, that will be after 1820, and then all we have to think of is the king. The Prince Regent, that wonderful man, became king, And as he got fatter, so did the furniture. And it's true. Just look at the furniture after 1820. The other leg that I mentioned is the cabriole, which is a dream to draw. This was the cabriole leg, and the French dancing term obviously meant that it ended or terminated in a cloven hoof foot. It was a dancing term for bounding and leaping, as animals with cloven hoof feet do. They bound and they leap. We didn't like that idea. We didn't like the French. We didn't like their foot. We did like that part. But we were, as I say, besotted by the Orient. And so we adopted what we now call the claw and ball foot. So cabriole leg, claw and ball foot. And that is symbolically or embolically the sacred pearl of wisdom being held by the dragon's claw. So French leg, Chinese foot, our heritage. Interesting, isn't it? Now, if we imagine there are little tables, like so, little side tables, made in the mid-18th century. And they look like that. There's the inexpensive version made for the doctors, that sort of class of people, professional people. And there are that type made for the wealthy people. And for the very wealthy people, they had things carved with great Rococo cabochon and raffle leaves around here and around the ankle, and usually around the bracket as well. 90% of all the furniture was made plain. About 5% was made with plain cabriole legs, and the rest, the 5% left, was made carved. That cost a fortune. It had to make you look, wow. You had to be standing back. Almost in candlelight, you'd need dark glasses because it was sparkle. Now, in the 1920s, in England, our major clients were Americans, and you could not sell a piece of plain English furniture. That little table I just showed you with the plain leg would be £5 or £6. 1745, £5 or £6 only. With a cabriole leg, I mean both cabriole legs, not just one, both cabriole legs, it would be maybe £20. A carved cabriole leg would enhance its value to £200. Okay? So, today, the difference would be £200–300 for a plain square leg table, nice little side table, very, very inexpensive, very good antiques. The best in the world, 1745, 1750, should be bought. Nice cabriole legs would be probably a couple of thousand. A carved, finely carved, authentically carved, in the 18th century, side table like that would be £20,000–30,000. So how do you tell the difference? How do you tell whether it was carved at a later date? Well, it's quite easy, really, but you must keep this to yourselves. When we started, the man who was preparing the leg for the carver allowed sufficient timber on the outside of the curve which was yet to be formed to enable him to carve his raffle scrolls and cabochon above the outline of the curve. When it was already formed, he had no such space outside to carve the cabochon or anything else. So once you look at a piece of furniture where the carving is within the outline, it will have to be done later. There's no way it would have been done at the time because it didn't look very good. It had to look like that. It had to really come out and hit you. That makes sense? Good. I could go on and on and on, but I think we're going to run a little short of time. What I've done is I've put some slides together to show you in illustrations exactly what I mean. I know it's repetition, but once it's sunk in, then, as I say, it's quite easy and you can do my job. Let's have a look at these pictures now, shall we?
John, the clicker's just there, sir.
Oh.
Just on that side.
I'm rather more used to a magic lantern with an oil lamp inside and slides. I just said to someone the other day, I'm older than most of the things I look at now on the roadshow. Look at this. Oh, God, no, sorry about that. Right. Things go together at a certain time. Oh, that reminds me. You can do this to almost any form of antiques. Looking at portraits. How can you tell a Charles II portrait to a George II portrait to a Regency portrait? Well, hairstyle's different. You see this top rail here, this high frame here. 2 or 3 things to talk about that. Can I go forwards and backwards with this? Oh, good. Look at his hair, see? Look at hers. It mirrors the furniture. Look at the back here, see? You know that's George I. You know that's beginning of the 18th century. Has to be. Fantastic. Let's go back here again. You see this chappie here. It was during the reign of Charles II, his restoration, where, again, so many things were coming from China. Porcelain, silks, spices, and cane. Cane for the first time. Instead of solid, blocky old chairs, we could cane panels in chairs and make them light enough. He had a set of folding chairs made for his racing on Hounslow Heath. He would have fold them up and take them with him. Flat packs. 1660 flat pack furniture. Wonderful. Now, the guide here to us immediately is this original caning? Yes, it is, because the caning is quite wide. You can put a 6pence or a 5p piece through those holes. By the time James II came to the throne by the 1680s, it was very much finer. And we'd got a lot more frills and furbelows with our costume, and so we had on the furniture. Okay? Now then, back to where we were. Little Chinese teapot, teacup or tea bowl. Oh, would you die for that? Isn't it lovely? Mm. And there's his high hair, so we know he's of that age, that period. Here's the baluster. There's the balustrading I was trying to draw, not so successfully when you look at the old one. There is the inverted version. Just simply turn the baluster upside down. There it is on a drinking glass. There it is on a tankard. There it is on the balustrading. There it is in a chair. And there it is in a table. So once you get used to that, you just look at something, you know that's before 1770, if it's original. But that's another story for now. But once you get this look in your mind, then everything sort of falls into place. The people look like that. They've flopped into chairs. They've got big, wide costumes, big frills, big hair. Wonderful. There's a pot. There's another pot. Don't you like this chap here? He's stirring chocolate. Do you know chocolate and coffee and tea became so popular? In 1650, the very first coffee shop opened in Oxford. 1650, easy to remember. By 1700, there were 500 coffee shops in London alone. That leaves Costa Coffee marketing way out of field. 500 in London. And when you went in, it was like this. And so you couldn't get served. And they used to have boxes on the wall. And you used to get to a box. And once you were seen putting a little money in there, you got served. And it said, to ensure prompt service. And ensure at that time was spelled I. So that said tips. And that's where we get tipping from today. You had to tip to get service. And if you go to America, you have to tip the maitre d' or whatever to get a table or whatever, to be looked after before you have service. So that's where it comes from. So I thought you'd like to see that. Look at his cloak. You couldn't have a little tiny dainty chair for him to sit in, could you? A big, big chair like that double-seated chair you just saw now. It's not antique. You can't specialize. You must generalize to get an idea. Doesn't matter, porcelain, silver, whatever. There's a stem of a screen. And look at these chaps here. One of flowers and freedom and colour. Gosh, it was lovely. That's a nice table. Now, that one, I suppose that because it's all originally carved, you see how the carving stands out? That's plain. This my God, look at those claws. I mean, that's a £100,000 table, if it's right. But if it's a recarved one, 500 or 600. Don't tell this to everybody, though. Now, because we were carving fine furniture, the first furniture designs in the classical style were carved. But as we started to import exotic timbers from foreign parts, we revived the art of marquetry. We'd had marquetry in the 1640s to 1690s. Then we revived it again in the 18th century in the classical style after the 1770s. So that patera, instead of being carved, was inlaid in a panel of marquetry. So that would be 1785, that could be 1775. There is a distinct line. High fashion demanded immediate change. It did not take years for these fashions to come through. They were smack on the button. Here we have the sideboard that I mentioned earlier. There's the serving table. And there are the two vases, or two urns rather, pedestals, where one would be hot, keep things hot, and one would be cold with ice in. And then here would be cordials served out of those two. We then, after the 1760s, combined the two. And this is the universal sideboard with its square taper legs, so you know it's after 1775, but it'll be before the 1790s because then it would have been turned legs. And in there was a little cooler, and in there originally was a little oven. But of course that didn't last long because it kept burning the place down, you know, I mean it all set fire. You couldn't separate it. So now you only find just a cooler box in one end, napery and stuff in there, and usually condiments in that end. But that was the great changeover. And as you now have seen, these would have been, as I say, turned legs after the 1790. Okay? I think we're nearly there. Well, look, there's the classical vase. There it is. The inspiration from the classical period, from the ancients, and that affected silver, glass, and porcelain with Josiah Wedgwood. And there's the Wedgwood vase. And there is lovely Henningham Hall up in Suffolk, where we epitomise the age of elegance. Everything was height and grace, and these wonderful fans, they went all the way over there. If only they'd have gone to Chichester, they needn't have bothered to go to Italy, because they're all there in Chichester, as you know, in the mosaics on the floor there. Lovely, lovely place. So basically, design-wise, this is what we're looking at. Before 1770, after 1770. How's that, all right? Clear.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not actually something you've discussed tonight, but a friend has a gilded mirror.
Right.
Which carved gilded mirror. How do you treat woodworm in a carved gilded mirror?
How do you deal with woodworm in a carved gilded mirror? It's not something that occurs very often because normally the wood is pine. So it would have been infected before it was carved, which is curious. The best way is to forget about it because the woodworm is now dead and it's unlikely to come back again. And it comes out in May. What he has to do is next year put a piece of paper underneath the mirror and make sure there is no dust. If there's no dust, forget it. Don't try and cover it up, don't try and fill it, just leave it alone. It won't do any more damage. If there is dust underneath, then it needs to be fumigated and you have to take it away. Somebody will put it in a tank and blast it with some anti-worm air. But whatever you do, do not, and I don't want to kill the sale of woodworm killer for anybody, but don't put that on because it's paraffin. Basically, they don't like paraffin. But they only breed once a year, they only come out once a year, and May is the time. And if there's no dust between, well, next May, then it's fine. All right? There was another question there.
Yes, I was interested in what you had to say about chair caning. I've been a chair caner, And first of all, it's almost impossible to find an old chair where the cane hasn't broken out, or got damaged because it's so fragile. And of course, it gets more and more fragile with age.
Yes.
And you see a lot of cane chairs in Ham House, which has a lot of furniture from the Charles II period. And I just can't believe that it hasn't been restored.
Well, you must remember that probably for the first 3 generations, it had cushions on. They had squab cushions, very flat squab cushions to the backs and to the seats. So they were never exposed, A, to much air, or at least half the air exposure, and B, to the jutting out bits of material and cloth and buttons and goodness knows what else, and people sitting straight onto them. A cushion, a swab, a horsehair cushion, as you know, will absorb a lot of the shock, a lot of the weight, and spreads the weight. It's the fact that when they took them off, they didn't bother to replace them. They didn't really use them. They were side chairs. For 100 years, they were side chairs. Then the Victorians revived it, and of course we brought in the old ones, and they just sat on them. And that's where the damage occurred. But those in Ham House or any of the period houses where it still exists, it's quite natural. For the first, as I say, 3 generations, 100 years of their life, they were not exposed to people using them as the Victorians did. So when we get them now, it's sad because you have to cover up a bit of the frame. And of course the best part about any of those chairs is the frame itself. But that's how they were worn. And of course the big tassels and look quite smart. Red velvet, red silk velvet, wonderful. But that's why they've lasted.
I'm interested in oil paintings.
Right.
And I'm finding it more difficult to identify original oil paintings rather than period pieces. Particularly, more recently, I've come across a term called Guy clay, which you may or may not have heard of, which is a very sophisticated paint spraying system onto canvas, which looks like an original. And at the weekend I was in a gallery in Wiltshire, looked at a painting by Dogart,
Right.
Oscar Dogart, which is he does still lifes.
Right.
And they were selling it as original, and only under inspection, even under a magnifying glass, they weren't sure if it were original. And I don't know, it's an embarrassing thing, but I'm starting to, the fakes are so sophisticated now, it's very difficult sometimes to see.
The question is how we tell the modern,
Yes.
the modern technology has taken over and making faking that much more easy.
Yes.
And there is only one answer. When I started, I said really it's not a matter of experience. What I've shown you is not a matter of experience, that's common sense. But when you get to the stage when paintings are being faked so convincingly,
Yes.
then it is a matter of experience. You really have to start at the bottom. You've really got to start by painting something yourself and getting used to the use of pigment and what oil can do, and then you have to take a short course on restoration. You have to go through the stages that an artist would go through, and then you can start to understand. It's a very, very complex subject.
We are doing a course on restoration. This is
Well, that's
what
the
we
best
do
thing
it,
you
and,
can do. That's the best thing you can do. I've just done a new DVD which will come out, plugging that mercilessly, by Christmas. And one of the things we deal with is, in fact, it's how to buy antiques and how to avoid this sort of problem.
Yes.
And we spend a great deal of time in a restoration workshop, a picture restoration workshop.
Oh, fantastic.
And that, to me, because I know nothing about it, is the most interesting. I pretend to know about it. Of course, I ask all the dumb questions. But it is really the only way. And I learned more about that in 2 hours in a restoration workshop. So you're doing the very best thing. Let me know how you get on, and I'll send you my DVD.